Welcome back to the channel, guys. We're going to be taking a look at Ubisoft's new title, Skull and Bones, here on the Steam Deck and the Lenovo Legion Go for our Z1 Extreme Performance. So on the Steam Deck, unfortunately, the game's not working for me on SteamOS just yet. We'll take a look at that, though. So I'm having to do that on Windows and GeForce Now, and then, of course, it is running over on the Legion Go. So getting into it, starting with the deck, I do have Ubisoft Connect here on SteamOS, which always works really well for me. But Skull and Bones just isn't wanting to launch without crashing. And no matter what kind of fixes we try to implement, it's just not working, no matter what kind of compatibility layers or whatever the case. Just isn't happening here yet. So hopefully this will get worked out to where we can get it to work this way, because I would like to be able to test its performance considering what we see over on Windows. Now, the only real way to pull this off here on something like the Steam Deck, if you're on SteamOS, would be something like GeForce Now streaming in the cloud. I have the ultimate tier with the 4080. I've tested this here plenty of times and shown how to install this on the channel. You can get a very solid 60 FPS at 800p, 1200p downscale or downsampled, whatever you want to do, at full graphics, ray tracing, all of that. It does run really well and streams really well if you're on good internet here on the Steam Deck. And I use GeForce Now on all of my handhelds pretty much daily. It's a great way to not only get more battery life, but have these games running and looking really great. But anyway, only way to really pull that off here, unfortunately, for SteamOS. But over on Windows here, I am on Windows 11 for the Steam Deck. The game is actually running pretty well, and I haven't really run into too many problems. So let's go ahead and get into what we got running here. So settings-wise, 1610, 800p, borderless, no limit on the FPS, though we're not going to get too high anyway here. Low settings, AMD FSR2 quality there for everything. I've done a lot of different testing with this game, and this is pretty much the way that I would run this. And 4 gigs of VRAM in BIOS. If you leave it to the default 1 gig, it is going to introduce some more stutter and issues versus the 4 gigabyte option here in BIOS that I am running. And for the most part, benchmark and in-game performance included, the game's running pretty decent. I mean, Ubisoft doesn't always have the best optimization with these games. I'm not saying this game has the best, but it certainly isn't as stuttery or giving me as many problems as some past Ubisoft older titles have on the Steam Deck or some of these other handhelds. So I thought this performance actually, even for the in-game benchmark, was pretty decent considering everything. And I know the game's been in development for a long time, but it does look good, and Ubisoft does make some pretty good looking games. And I wasn't really sure what our performance would be like, especially this hub area here in the beginning that tends to drop FPS quite a bit, as do some of the other ports. We're still able to stay above that 30 FPS threshold, and this would actually be a decent title to lock to 30 FPS on the Steam Deck with Windows 11 here if we wanted to, but I just left things unlocked for the video. Now, when we get out and we're sailing on the water, typical, we get more performance for the most part when we're out doing this, until you get into battle and you get closer to some ships and things like that. But ultimately, this performance winds up being pretty good once you get out sailing. Now, when you get into combat, that's when, of course, things are getting more busy. We've got like 4 or 5 ships here all firing on each other. I jumped in here and got a little bit involved, and your frame rate will come down from the 50s into the 40s and the 30s. But again, I never really dipped below that 30 mark, no matter where I went or what I was doing, which was great to see with these settings. So ultimately, the game's running pretty decently here on Windows on the Steam Deck. And again, that's kind of why I wish it would launch up for me over on SteamOS, because I have a hunch the performance would be pretty decent. I would like to be able to test it there. So we'll have to see. If it does start working over on SteamOS, maybe we'll go back and take a look at it. But if you're running Windows 11 on your Steam Deck, this is actually running pretty well. And if you're a cloud gamer like I am and using something like GeForce Now, it's running really well over there, and you could stream it on SteamOS as long as you have a good internet connection. All right, let's get over and move and take a look at the Lenovo Legion Go. All right, so for the Legion Go, we're going to be looking at 20 watts mostly, but a little bit of 20 and 30 here. And we'll look at those low settings, very similar to what we had on Steam Deck first. But when we get to in-game, I'll show you what I'm actually running on the Go that I think is working really well here. We have the additional performance to play with, so it works out well. Now, I did do a 4 benchmark comparison here for 800p with low FSR2 quality and medium with low environment detail FSR2 quality, which is where we're going to land on for settings when we go take a look at real world performance and kind of how I've been playing the game. But you can see here at 20 watts and 30 watts the comparison between low at the top there and on the bottom when we come to the medium and low environment with the 20 and 30 watts, really depending on what you want to pull out of the game, and especially if you're docked or not will depend on what you really want to push here for things with Skull and Bones. But for me, pretty much kind of going with that 20 watt range, and the medium / low settings that I have here has been working really well. And our average FPS 66 to 68 there at the top, and 54 to 59 at the bottom for those settings at 20 and 30 watts. So maybe that'll give you a general idea where you want to head. And taking a look at 800p native TA, so we're not really doing upscaling or anything here, performance was lower, and it's not something I would necessarily want to run unless I just absolutely didn't want to upscale anything or use FSR. But you do lose quite a few FPS here, a bit of performance. When things get busy later on, it does get a little bit worse. 56 on the average FPS there, but again, it can get hit pretty hard later on in certain areas. Now 1200p low FSR2 performance, we get kind of closer to that 800p quality that we were looking at, or maybe even the native TAA. So it does work, but overall it does use a little bit more VRAM, and the picture quality isn't necessarily as good in my opinion versus like the 800p at quality. 57 average FPS though for running it that way. But what it does tell you is there's quite a lot of overhead to run things there how you want. 800p though, medium settings with TAA turned back over to FSR2 quality here, and then we turn environment details down to low. This seems to be a pretty good spot to up the graphical settings for the game and also give us enough performance where we don't really take much of a hit here. And I typically just stick with the 20 watts as well for their, like, you know, your performance mode on your Go, like the red ring or whatever. That works really well here. But anyway, 20 watts here with these settings, 800p medium with low environment detail, FSR2 quality, 4 gigs of VRAM. Things run pretty well, and overall we're going to get what, 10 to 15 FPS more here than we were getting over on the Steam Deck, which I kind of figured with the Z1 Extreme over the deck. Runs really well here on Windows 11. And then if we cut over to 30 watts, you see here it raises even more. Now this isn't always the case. You're still going to dip down at 30 watts in certain areas, so unless you're docked and really just wanting to push that performance, I wouldn't worry about 25 watts handheld or 30 docked. I'd really just stick with 20 watts, keep the thermals down a bit. Performance stays really good, and a lot of your time is going to be spent out on the water, and performance is a bit higher there anyway. We saw the same thing over on Steam Deck. We get out here and we get increased performance where we can be in the 50s to 60s, even sometimes in the 70s, depending on what's going on here. And same idea when you get into battle. We get a little bit better performance here, 10 to 20 FPS more than over on the deck. But when you do get closer to some of these ships and there's a lot going on, your FPS is going to lower as you get closer, and it's rendering in all of that detail, and you're just kind of getting into figuring all that out. So it could get down to close to like the performance you were getting when you were running around the hub or the port. But overall though, frame times look really good, stays solid, and I haven't had any problems here with the performance. And same thing here, coming up on a different ship, starting off in the 60s. As we get a little bit closer, she'll come down in FPS a little bit, but no big deal. It all runs really well here on the Z1 Extreme, on the Legion Go. Again, 30 watts if you need that little bit more push, but for the most part, especially if you're handheld, 20 watts seems to be a pretty good sweet spot here. Now, your weather can get pretty nutty as well, and combat's actually really fun when you get into like these waves, you're trying to aim and everything. It can get a little nutty, but performance is really good. I was up in the 70s at this point. At some points when I would get in battle, it would do the same thing, 40s, 50s, depending on what was going on there. But it didn't really affect things or make it worse, but it is a lot of fun to navigate through. But yeah, ultimately performance on the Legion Go here is really good. 20 watts or 30, whatever you want to do, 25 handheld, but I think 20 is a pretty decent sweet spot. 1200p if you really want to, with, you know, quality or balanced or maybe performance FSR, depending on what you're shooting for. But I ultimately think the 800p at quality, or even if you want to go TAA and adjust some things there, works pretty well and looks really nice on here. So alright guys, that's pretty much going to do it for the video. Your performance for Skull and Bones on the Steam Deck and on the Legion Go. Thanks a lot for coming to watch as always, and I'll see you guys in the next one.